In the dimly lit room where this interview was recorded, an interview that would never see the light of day through official channels, we find a contemplative Carl, his eyes reflecting the cosmic wonder that made him famous. Yet today, he wasn't here to discuss distant galaxies, but something much closer to home, the ultimate frontier of human existence. The universe, he begins, his voice carrying that familiar cadence, is not only stranger than we imagine, it is stranger than we can imagine. And nowhere is this more evident than in our understanding, or lack thereof, of consciousness. I leaned forward, sensing we were entering territory far removed from his public persona. You've been known as a skeptic, a voice of scientific reason. What changed? Nothing changed, he replied with a gentle smile. Science itself demands we follow evidence wherever it leads. And for decades, I've been privately collecting evidence that suggests consciousness may not be merely a product of brain activity. He reached for a folder beside him. These are documented cases from medical journals spanning 3 continents. Patients who, while clinically dead, no brain activity, no vital signs, reported accurate observations of their surroundings, of conversations occurring outside their range of perception. But couldn't these be explained by hallucinations, last neural firing? I once thought so too. He leaned forward. But then, I encountered cases where individuals correctly identified objects placed in operating rooms after their death was pronounced. Objects deliberately placed as part of controlled studies. The camera zoomed in as he spread photographs across the table. Hospital rooms, surgical instruments, handwritten notes, all supposedly identified by those who had temporarily crossed the threshold. The academic establishment has systematically marginalized this research, he continued. Not because the methodology is flawed, but because the implications are too profound. We're talking about the possibility that consciousness, what some might call the soul, exists independent of the physical brain. Are you suggesting this is scientific evidence for the soul? His eyes met mine with unexpected intensity. I'm suggesting that what we call soul might be a form of energy pattern we haven't yet learned to measure. Quantum physics has already shown us that reality at its most fundamental level behaves in ways that defy our classical understanding. He paused, choosing his words carefully. The double-slit experiment demonstrates that observation itself affects physical reality. Entanglement shows us that particles, once connected, remain somehow aware of each other across any distance. These aren't mystical concepts, they're established science. Then why hasn't this research been more widely published? Because science operates within paradigms, he said, and data that threatens to collapse the dominant paradigm often faces extraordinary resistance. Copernicus, Darwin, Einstein, all faced it. The notion that consciousness might be fundamental rather than emergent from matter would require rewriting physics, neuroscience, biology. The academic and funding consequences for pursuing such research are significant. The room fell silent for a moment before he continued. I've spent my career advocating for empirical evidence, for the scientific method. I haven't abandoned that position. I'm simply suggesting that we apply those same rigorous standards to phenomena that challenge our assumptions about consciousness. He reached for a glass of water, his hand momentarily trembling. What you're seeing in this interview is not a rejection of science, but its expansion. The true scientific position is not to dismiss uncomfortable data, but to pursue it with even greater diligence precisely because it challenges us. Outside, the sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the room. What began as a standard interview had clearly evolved into something profound, a confession from a man whose public life had been dedicated to rational skepticism, yet whose private investigations had led him somewhere unexpected. We're only at the beginning, he said quietly. The evidence for consciousness beyond physical death is not yet conclusive, but it is substantial enough that dismissing it outright would be intellectually dishonest. The camera lingered on his face, capturing something rarely seen in his public appearances, a vulnerable uncertainty, the look of someone who has glimpsed beyond the veil of conventional understanding. The interview continued as shadows lengthened across the room. The atmosphere had changed. What began as an intellectual discussion had transformed into something more intimate, a confession of sorts. Let me tell you about patient 17, Carl said, removing a manila folder from his briefcase. A woman declared clinically dead for 7 minutes following cardiac arrest. Upon resuscitation, she described floating above her body, watching the medical team's efforts. But here's what's remarkable. She correctly identified a sequence of random numbers displayed on a monitor that was deliberately placed facing away from her body, visible only from a vantage point near the ceiling. I studied the documented case, noting the signatures of multiple attending physicians. This could revolutionize our understanding of consciousness. It already has, for those willing to examine the evidence, he replied. But such cases are merely the surface of a much deeper phenomenon. Carl rose from his chair and walked to a chalkboard positioned nearby. With deliberate strokes, he began sketching quantum wave functions and probability fields. Traditional neuroscience insists consciousness emerges from neurochemical processes, essentially that mind is what brain does. But quantum physics suggests a different possibility, that consciousness may be fundamental to reality itself, not merely an emergent property. His chalk traced elegant equations across the board. The measurement problem in quantum mechanics reveals something profound. Particles exist in states of superposition until observed. The act of observation itself appears to collapse wave functions into definite states. Are you suggesting consciousness affects physical reality at a quantum level? I'm suggesting we consider the possibility, he answered carefully. And if consciousness can affect physical reality, might it not exist independent of it? What we're discovering about quantum entanglement, what Einstein called spooky action at a distance, indicates that connected quantum systems remain correlated regardless of physical separation. His fingers tapped against the chalkboard. Now imagine consciousness as a quantum field phenomenon, rather than merely a classical neurological one. Such a field wouldn't necessarily terminate when the physical brain ceases function. You're describing a scientific framework for what religions have called the soul. He nodded slowly. Though I'd prefer more precise terminology. What if consciousness is a fundamental property of the universe, like electromagnetic fields or gravity, that interacts with, but is not produced by, neural tissue? The brain might be more receiver than generator. The camera zoomed in on diagrams he'd been sketching, illustrations of quantum field interactions across dimensional boundaries. My colleagues would consider this heretical, he admitted. Throughout my career, I've advocated for skepticism, for empirical verification. I haven't abandoned those principles. But true skepticism means questioning our assumptions, even our most fundamental ones, about the nature of consciousness and reality. He returned to his seat, visibly fatigued, yet animated by the discussion. There's a consistent pattern in near-death experiences across cultures and throughout history. Perceptions of leaving the body, moving through darkness toward light, encountering deceased loved ones, accessing knowledge seemingly impossible to obtain through normal means. Couldn't these be culturally conditioned hallucinations? That was my initial hypothesis, he acknowledged. But then, we began finding these patterns in young children with no prior exposure to such concepts. In individuals from isolated cultures with no contact with Western media, the universality suggests something beyond cultural programming. He pulled out another file. Here's where it becomes more scientifically intriguing. We've documented cases where individuals during these experiences accessed information they couldn't possibly have known. Details about distant deceased relatives later verified. Technical information about surgical procedures they had no training to understand. Accurate observations of events occurring miles away while they were clinically dead. The weight of what he was suggesting hung in the air between us. The most disturbing cases involve blind patients, blind from birth, who during these experiences report visual perceptions for the first time. They describe colors, objects, and environments they've never seen, with remarkable accuracy. How does one explain a congenitally blind person correctly describing the pattern on a doctor's tie or the color of a nurse's shoes? He clasped his hands together, studying them intently before looking up. These aren't anecdotes. These are documented cases from medical literature, cases I've personally investigated. They suggest that consciousness may have perceptual capabilities independent of our physical senses. If this is true, I ventured, why hasn't the scientific community embraced these findings? A sad smile crossed his face. Because science advances one funeral at a time. Paradigm shifts don't occur through gentle evolution of thought, but through revolutionary breaks. And what we're discussing here, the possibility that consciousness transcends physical death, would constitute the most profound paradigm shift in scientific history. Outside, darkness had fallen completely. The only illumination came from the soft glow of lamps, casting our conversation in an ethereal light appropriate to its subject matter. "We stand at the threshold," he said quietly, "not just of a new scientific understanding, but of a fundamental reconsideration of what it means to be human." The midnight hour approached as our conversation delved deeper into territories rarely explored in scientific discourse. Carl's demeanor had changed subtly, the public persona of careful scientific restraint giving way to a man compelled to share what he believed might be the most significant scientific revelation of our age. "What I'm about to show you," he said, unlocking a weathered leather briefcase, "represents 15 years of classified research conducted across 9 countries. Research that has been systematically removed from peer-reviewed journals, funding quietly withdrawn whenever promising results emerged." He spread a series of brain scans across the table, colourful topographic maps of neural activity unlike any I'd seen published. These were taken from terminal patients who gave consent to be monitored during their final moments, and when possible, after clinical death was pronounced. His finger traced unusual patterns in the scans. We expected to see diminishing activity as cellular functions ceased. Instead, we found something extraordinary. The images showed intense bursts of coordinated neural firing in specific regions, the pineal gland, parts of the temporal lobe, and certain limbic structures, occurring minutes after all other brain activity had flatlined. "Conventional neuroscience can't explain this," he continued. "These patterns don't resemble random neural discharge or oxygen-deprived hallucinations. They show remarkable coherence and complexity, almost as if the brain were suddenly processing massive amounts of information." "How many cases have documented this phenomenon?" I asked. 87 confirmed cases across 3 separate research initiatives, all with identical protocols, all yielding statistically significant results. He looked up, his expression grave, and all subsequently defunded or discredited through academic politics rather than scientific refutation. He revealed a second set of scans, these taken using modified magnetoencephalography capable of detecting subtler electromagnetic signatures. "What you're seeing here suggests that consciousness doesn't simply switch off like a light. Rather, it appears to undergo a phase transition, shifting from localized neural activity to a more distributed field pattern that gradually detaches from the physical substrate. You're describing consciousness leaving the body in scientific terms. I'm describing what the data indicates," he corrected gently. "The interpretation remains open, but the phenomenon itself has been repeatedly observed under controlled conditions." He pulled out a thick binder filled with interview transcripts. These are accounts from medical professionals, physicians, nurses, hospice workers, who've witnessed consistent phenomena around dying patients. Not just the familiar reports of patients seeing deceased relatives, but objective observations. Medical equipment malfunctioning in patterns that defy statistical probability, unexplained electromagnetic anomalies, and perhaps most compelling, dying patients accurately reporting conversations occurring in other rooms of the hospital. Why would the scientific establishment suppress this research? Carl's expression darkened. Because it threatens the prevailing paradigm that consciousness is merely an epiphenomenon of brain activity. If consciousness can exist independent of the brain, even temporarily, it undermines the materialist foundation of modern science. The implications cascade through every field: physics, biology, psychology, medicine. The academic careers built on the current paradigm. The pharmaceutical approaches predicated on consciousness being merely neurochemical. The theological implications. He paused, gathering himself. I've spent my life championing rational inquiry, fighting against superstition and pseudoscience. The irony isn't lost on me that I'm now advocating for research that some of my colleagues would dismiss as mysticism. But I haven't abandoned empiricism. I'm following where the evidence leads, regardless of my personal comfort with the destination. From another folder, he produced documents stamped with government classification markers. In the 1970s, multiple intelligence agencies investigated consciousness as a non-local phenomenon, remote viewing, telepathy, and yes, survival beyond bodily death. The research yielded results significant enough that the programs continued for decades, despite official denials. Not because these agencies were interested in spiritual matters, but because the data suggested tactical applications. You're referring to the declassified Stargate program. Stargate was merely the publicly acknowledged tip of a much larger research initiative, he replied. What was never declassified were the findings related to consciousness surviving death, findings that correlated with our independent medical research. He rubbed his eyes, fatigue evident in his movements. The most compelling cases involve individuals with no prior knowledge of quantum mechanics, spontaneously describing, during near-death states, precisely the kind of quantum field dynamics that our most advanced theoretical physicists are only now beginning to formulate. People with no scientific training using terminology and concepts that align perfectly with cutting-edge models of non-local consciousness. Outside, a gentle rain had begun to fall, droplets tapping against the windows like distant Morse code. There's a consistent pattern in these experiences, he continued. Subjects report accessing a vast informational field, experiencing what some traditions have called the Akashic records, or the collective unconscious. They describe it not as mystical revelation, but as direct perception of an underlying reality, normally filtered out by our biological limitations. And you believe this represents actual access to some field of consciousness rather than hallucination? What I believe is less important than what the data suggests, he replied carefully. And the data increasingly points to consciousness as a field phenomenon that intersects with, but is not generated by, neurological processes. A quantum field that may continue to exist when its physical interface, the brain, no longer functions. The implications hung in the air between us, profound and unsettling. This interview, he said quietly, will never be broadcast through conventional channels. The paradigm is too entrenched, the institutional resistance too powerful. But perhaps in time, as more evidence accumulates, what seems radical today will become tomorrow's scientific orthodoxy. As dawn approached, our conversation reached its final phase. The interview had transcended its original format, becoming something more intimate, a scientific testament from a man who sensed his remaining time was limited. I need to address the ultimate question, Carl said, his voice steady despite his evident exhaustion. What exactly happens to consciousness after physical death? Based on the accumulated evidence, I can offer not certainty, but a scientifically informed hypothesis. He walked to the window, watching as the first pale light illuminated the landscape. The data suggests consciousness doesn't extinguish, it transforms. The patterns we've observed indicate a phase transition from localized awareness, bound to a physical substrate, to a non-local state that interfaces with what we might call a cosmic consciousness field. You're describing a scientific basis for what religions have called the afterlife. I'm describing what the evidence indicates, he replied carefully, though I must emphasize that this afterlife bears little resemblance to traditional religious conceptions. What we're seeing suggests not a paradise or punishment realm, but rather a return to a fundamental state. Consciousness, rejoining a larger field from which it was temporarily individuated. He returned to his seat, gathering scattered papers into organized piles. Think of it as similar to how water molecules, frozen into unique snowflakes, eventually melt and return to the ocean. The unique pattern isn't lost, it's recorded in the informational structure of the whole, but the rigid individuation dissolves. This sounds remarkably like certain Eastern philosophical traditions. Indeed, he nodded, which raises an intriguing possibility. Perhaps these traditions weren't merely philosophical speculations, but records of experiences accessed through meditation states neurologically similar to the dying process. What if mystics throughout history were describing the same reality our instruments are now detecting? He produced one final document, a complex mathematical model filled with quantum field equations. This theoretical framework, developed by physicists working outside mainstream academia, proposes consciousness as a fundamental property of the universe, not emergent from matter, but intrinsic to reality itself, like space and time. According to this model, our brains don't generate consciousness. They filter and localize it from a universal field. If consciousness is fundamental rather than emergent, it changes everything. Precisely, he said, his eyes brightening. It would mean consciousness doesn't require biological structures to exist. only to exist in the specific localized form we experience as human awareness. Death would represent not consciousness ending, but expanding, the dissolution of boundaries that maintained its individual expression. He spread out a final series of brain scans, these taken from advanced meditators entering deep contemplative states. What's remarkable is that these patterns in experienced meditators closely resemble what we see in the dying brain. The same coherent oscillations, the same synchronization of normally disparate neural regions. It's as if deep meditation temporarily replicates the consciousness phase transition we observe during death. Are you suggesting meditation provides a glimpse of the afterlife state? I'm suggesting it may temporarily access the same field state that consciousness transitions to permanently after death. He paused, choosing his words carefully. The reports from both near-death experiences and deep meditative states describe remarkably similar phenomena: a sense of boundlessness, access to seemingly unlimited information, dissolution of the separate self, and a profound interconnection with all existence. Outside, the sun had fully risen, bathing the room in golden light. What troubles me most, he continued, isn't the suppression of this research, but the implications of its eventual acceptance. If consciousness survives death and returns to a unified field state, it suggests we've fundamentally misunderstood not just human nature, but the structure of reality itself. Why would this understanding be threatening rather than liberating? His expression grew somber. Because it would require rewriting not just scientific textbooks, but our entire civilizational narrative. Our economic systems, our social structures, our educational models, all are predicated on a materialist paradigm that treats consciousness as an epiphenomenon and death as final extinction. A scientifically verified continuation of consciousness would trigger the most profound revolution in human thought since the Copernican displacement of Earth from the center of the cosmos. He gazed directly into the camera, as if addressing not just me, but future viewers of this suppressed interview. I've spent my career advocating for evidence-based inquiry and rational skepticism. Nothing I've shared contradicts those principles. True skepticism means following evidence wherever it leads, even when it challenges our most fundamental assumptions. His voice grew quieter, more reflective. Throughout human history, we've repeatedly discovered that reality is vaster and stranger than our limited perception suggests. We once believed Earth was flat and stationary, that humans were fundamentally different from other animals, that the Milky Way constituted the entire universe. Each expansion of understanding required painful revisions of our self-conception. He gathered his papers, preparing to conclude our marathon conversation. What I've shared represents not a final conclusion, but the opening of a new frontier of scientific inquiry. The evidence for consciousness surviving death is substantial enough that dismissing it requires more intellectual contortions than considering its implications. We stand at the threshold of potentially the most significant scientific revolution in human history. As we prepared to end the interview, I asked one final question. Why risk your scientific reputation by discussing these findings publicly? He smiled gently. Because truth matters more than reputation. Because the data deserves honest evaluation regardless of its philosophical implications. And because if consciousness indeed continues beyond death, as the evidence increasingly suggests, then the greatest disservice to humanity would be to withhold this knowledge out of fear or academic orthodoxy. The camera lingered on his face, earnest, thoughtful, a man who had journeyed from strict scientific materialism to a more expansive understanding of consciousness and reality. The cosmos is within us, he concluded. We are made of star stuff, and perhaps, in ways we're only beginning to comprehend scientifically, our consciousness is as eternal as the stars themselves. The interview ended. The tape was shelved, hidden away, until now. If this forbidden interview shook your understanding of consciousness and what lies beyond, don't keep this revelation to yourself. Subscribe now to receive future suppressed knowledge that challenges our fundamental understanding of reality. Comment below with your own experiences or thoughts on consciousness surviving death. Were Carl's insights revolutionary science or speculative theory? The truth is waiting to be discovered, and your voice matters in this cosmic conversation. Hit subscribe. Some knowledge is too important to remain hidden.